It all started with United States versus Brewster, a high-profile corruption case that had the media in a frenzy. Judge Ronald Brewster, a well-respected yet controversial figure in the legal system, was presiding over a case involving massive corporate fraud. But behind the scenes, whispers of his own corruption had been growing louder for months. J.D. Vance, a rising political force and an outspoken critic of corruption, had been tracking Brewster's suspicious rulings. Some of the biggest corporations and political figures had seemingly escaped justice under his gavel. Whistleblowers, journalists, and even FBI insiders had begun piecing together a picture of a judge who had sold his courtroom to the highest bidder. Now, Vance had finally gathered enough evidence to challenge Brewster's authority in the public eye. But Judge Brewster was not a man who tolerated opposition. As J.D. Vance prepared to attend a crucial hearing, one that could determine the fate of a billion-dollar fraud case, he already knew that Brewster had a personal vendetta against him. The judge despised everything Vance stood for: accountability, transparency, and exposing the elite's corruption. That morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat, cameras flashed, and tensions ran high. J.D. Vance sat in the front row, knowing what was coming. Judge Brewster, dressed in his traditional black robe, adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Vance with a smirk. Well, if it isn't our favorite senator. Tell me, Mr. Vance, are you here to lecture us all on draining the swamp again? Or are you just here for the cameras? The courtroom fell silent. A few reporters scribbled furiously, knowing that this was the headline they had been waiting for. J.D. Vance remained calm, leaning forward slightly. I'm here for justice, Your Honor. And justice doesn't care about power. Judge Brewster chuckled. Justice? That's a good one. Let's get on with the hearing before we waste any more time. Little did he know, the walls were closing in on him. As the hearing continued, J.D. Vance watched Judge Brewster carefully. The judge, with his arrogant smirk and dismissive tone, was completely unaware that behind the scenes, things were already in motion. For months, a team of federal investigators had been secretly tracking Brewster's activities. His lavish lifestyle, mansions, offshore accounts, and luxury vacations didn't match his judge's salary. Whistleblowers had come forward with explosive claims. Brewster was selling verdicts to the highest bidder. Fortune 500 companies, corrupt politicians, and even foreign entities had been paying him off to manipulate the justice system. Vance had personally handed some of the findings to the FBI. But now the goal was to bait Brewster into making a public mistake. And then it happened. During the hearing, as the defense attorneys presented their case, Judge Brewster openly mocked the prosecution, shutting down their arguments with clear bias. This entire fraud case is built on fairy tales, he scoffed. Mr. Vance, maybe you should focus on politics instead of pretending to be an expert on the law. The courtroom gasped. It was an obvious attack. Even the news networks, which had long protected Brewster, couldn't ignore this. Cameras zoomed in on his sneering expression. Vance remained composed. I believe the law is clear, Your Honor. Fraud on this scale cannot be dismissed so easily. But Brewster wasn't done. He leaned forward, eyes cold. Senators don't get to tell judges how to do their jobs. Unless you'd like to be held in contempt. That was it. That was the moment. Because at that very second, FBI agents listening in from a surveillance van had all the confirmation they needed. Brewster's arrogance had just sealed his fate. Unbeknownst to Brewster, the FBI had been running a deep undercover operation for months. Agents posing as corporate lobbyists had approached the judge with lucrative bribes, recording every interaction. They had it all on tape. Brewster discussing favorable rulings in exchange for offshore payments. His ties to a secret network of corrupt attorneys and CEOs. His off-the-record conversations with politicians who wanted cases to disappear. And now, with his blatant public display of bias in Vance's case, the DOJ was ready to move. But taking down a federal judge was not easy. If they rushed in too soon, he could use his influence to escape punishment. So the FBI decided to push him further. They would bait him into making the ultimate mistake, accepting a bribe on camera. At the same time, J.D. Vance launched a media firestorm. He took to national television that night, saying, Americans are tired of corrupt officials abusing their power. We have to clean up this system, no matter how high it reaches. Twitter exploded. The public started digging up Brewster's past shady rulings. His name trended nationwide. Even his longtime political allies were starting to distance themselves. Brewster could feel the heat. He needed one last payday before everything collapsed. 3 days later, Brewster arranged a secret meeting at a private club. He thought he was speaking with a powerful corporate donor. In reality, he was talking to an undercover FBI agent. They discussed a massive fraud case set to go to trial the following month. The agent posed as a billionaire investor who needed a favorable ruling to avoid billions in losses. Brewster leaned in. You know how this works. If we're going to make this happen, there's a price. The agent slid a briefcase across the table. Inside, $500,000 in cash. Brewster grinned. Consider it done. The moment his hands touched the money, FBI agents stormed the room. Judge Brewster, you're under arrest for bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. He froze. His face turned white as he realized it was over. As Brewster was dragged away in handcuffs, news stations broke the story. Breaking, federal judge arrested in FBI sting operation. J.D. Vance, watching from his office, received a phone call. It's done, the voice on the other end said. Vance simply nodded. He knew that this was just the beginning. The swamp was deeper than anyone had imagined. But today, they had taken down one of its most powerful figures. And the fight wasn't over yet. As Judge Brewster's arrest made headlines, J.D. Vance was acutely aware that this was just the tip of the iceberg. His own research and the FBI's findings had painted a grim picture. Brewster wasn't working alone. The investigation into Brewster's dealings began to unravel deeper layers. Soon, agents uncovered his connections to a vast network of high-powered lobbyists, political operatives, and business moguls, many of whom had been pulling strings behind the scenes for years, influencing cases and even legislative agendas. A new name surfaced in the investigation: Senator Howard Dawes, a respected figure with a clean public image but deep ties to Brewster's corrupt network. Dawes had been in power for decades, and his cozy relationship with the judge had allowed him to benefit from the manipulation of court cases involving his political allies. Vance felt the weight of the next step. Exposing Senator Dawes would be no easy task. The senator had enough influence to derail the investigation entirely. But the evidence they had collected was undeniable. A whistleblower came forward, someone close to Dawes' inner circle. This person had worked as a campaign manager for the senator and knew everything about the backdoor deals, including the direct payments to Brewster from Dawes' largest donors. J.D. knew the timing had to be perfect. They needed to bring both Brewster and Dawes down at the same time, but the public was still reeling from the judge's arrest. The senator had to be exposed without tipping his hand. Vance had a meeting with his trusted team of lawyers and media strategists. They knew that exposing Senator Dawes would take more than just evidence. It would take public pressure and a coordinated attack on his reputation. The media was already in a frenzy, and J.D. Vance had been positioned as the voice of accountability. The public was hungry for more details, demanding to know how deep the corruption ran. Vance decided to hold a press conference that would change everything. He revealed that new evidence had emerged linking Senator Howard Dawes to Judge Brewster's fraudulent activities. The senator's connection to the judge was more than just casual. It was coordinated, with direct payments made through shady shell companies. Vance's press conference sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Dawes denied everything, calling Vance's accusations unsubstantiated and political theatrics, but his deflection only made him look guilty to the public. The next day, more evidence surfaced, including photographs of Senator Dawes meeting with Brewster at a private golf club just days before a critical court decision was made in his favor. The pieces were coming together, and the pressure was mounting. Senator Dawes, now under federal investigation, found himself at a crossroads. His political career was on the line, and the pressure from both the media and his party was becoming unbearable. Behind closed doors, he made a desperate call to Brewster's legal team, hoping to gain some clarity on his next steps. He was informed that the judge had already flipped on him, offering to cooperate with the federal authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence. Dawes was trapped. His web of deceit was about to unravel, and he couldn't escape it. It was a matter of time before the public and the FBI would bring down his empire. But how could he protect himself and salvage what little power he had left? Vance was carefully watching. The moment Dawes made a mistake, it would be his undoing. And J.D. had been laying the groundwork for the final blow. He needed to make Dawes sweat just a little bit more. With Senator Dawes back against the wall, Vance's team had a risky plan: push Dawes into a corner. He would be baited into making a rash decision, one that could be the final piece of evidence needed to bring him down. The FBI had been quietly tracking Dawes' private meetings and phone calls. One night, the senator was caught arranging a private meeting with one of his largest donors. This time, it wasn't just a casual talk, it was a deal. In exchange for his continued silence and support, the senator was offered millions of dollars. Vance and the FBI were ready to strike. They had the meeting recorded and a full plan in place. As soon as Dawes accepted the bribe, they would have him on tape. In a final desperate attempt to save himself, Dawes tried to make contact with J.D. Vance directly. He offered a deal. If Vance kept quiet about his involvement in the bribery, he could use his political influence to shut down any further investigations into Vance's legal cases. But Vance wasn't interested in deals. "It's too late for that, Senator," Vance replied. "The people have already spoken, and your time is up." With a bribe in hand, the FBI swooped in. Senator Dawes was arrested. His reputation, along with his political career, crumbled. The fall of Judge Brewster and Senator Dawes was a landmark victory in the fight against corruption. J.D. Vance became a national hero, hailed for his courage in exposing the judicial system's flaws. But the victory came at a price. The political establishment, although temporarily shaken, rallied together to protect the integrity of the system. But no one could ignore the damage that had been done. 4 weeks after the arrests, investigations continued. New names began to surface, and it became clear that this scandal was part of a much larger network of influence. Corrupt judges, politicians, and corporate leaders were all tangled together, their webs of deceit and manipulation stretching across the country. J.D. Vance knew that his fight was far from over. With every victory, the system fought back, but he had one thing on his side: the truth. As the dust settled, Vance stared out of his office window, contemplating the future. More corruption would be exposed, but he also knew the next battle was just beginning. As the fallout from the arrests of Judge Brewster and Senator Dawes began to ripple through the country, J.D. Vance couldn't shake the feeling that there was more lurking beneath the surface. Despite the high-profile arrests and media attention, he had always suspected that this corruption wasn't just local, it was global. After months of digging, Vance and his team received an unexpected lead from a former intelligence officer. This individual had been working with international organizations focused on exposing corrupt practices in foreign governments and businesses. The officer revealed a chilling truth: Brewster and Dawes were only pawns in a much larger international network. The senator's connections weren't just domestic, they spanned continents. Vance learned that money from global financial institutions had been funneled into the United States through complex layers of shell companies, with links to organized crime syndicates operating in Eastern Europe and South America. The judge had been an unwitting partner in laundering billions of dollars, masking it as legitimate political influence. The more Vance investigated, the more he realized the depth of the corruption that was entrenched in global politics, business, and even the judicial system. He wasn't just fighting for justice in his country, he was now fighting for the integrity of global governance. With this new information in hand, J.D. Vance knew he had to act quickly and strategically. He reached out to his trusted allies, international law enforcement agencies, and investigative journalists, to build a coordinated operation that would expose the global connections behind the corruption. This would require a level of secrecy and precision far beyond anything he had previously orchestrated. The plan was simple: shut down the entire international criminal network by exposing every corrupt link, from the financial institutions that laundered money to the politicians and judges who accepted the bribes. The FBI would act domestically, while international partners would handle operations in Europe, South America, and Asia. But the stakes were high. The criminals involved were powerful, dangerous, and had no intention of being exposed. If they sensed that their operation was at risk, they would likely disappear into the shadows, making it almost impossible to trace their steps. Vance knew that timing was everything. If they launched too early, the network might close ranks. But if they waited too long, they could lose their chance to take down the global syndicate. As Vance's team dug deeper into the international ties, they uncovered a shocking discovery. The entire global operation, it turned out, had been orchestrated by someone far more powerful and elusive than anyone had imagined. A reclusive billionaire, whose name had never been publicly associated with corruption, was a true mastermind behind the web of influence that spanned across multiple continents. This individual had shaped global markets, manipulated elections, and controlled massive swaths of media. His name had remained hidden for years, buried beneath layers of intermediaries and cutouts. Vance and his team, with the help of international intelligence, were able to track the billionaire's movements. They discovered that he had been operating out of a luxury compound in the Swiss Alps, a place protected by private security forces and surrounded by a network of loyalists. The question now was, how could they bring him to justice? The investigation had reached the tipping point. J.D. Vance had spent weeks strategizing with international authorities to make sure this operation was airtight. They had gathered enough evidence to expose the billionaire's influence over judges, senators, and international business moguls. But the final phase of the operation would require precision and nerves of steel. Vance had a difficult decision to make. Should he strike immediately and risk the billionaire's powerful network launching a counterattack, or should he play the waiting game, allowing the criminals to grow too confident before hitting them where it hurt? He decided that the time for waiting was over. The FBI had enough information, and the international law enforcement agencies were ready to launch their sting operation. The Global Task Force, including top cybersecurity specialists, launched the coordinated takedown. The Swiss compound was raided by authorities, but the mastermind was no longer there. He had vanished, leaving behind a trail of secrets and connections that spanned the globe. But this wasn't a defeat. It was a revelation. They had the pieces of the puzzle. Months after the arrest of Judge Brewster, Senator Dawes, and the international takedown of the billionaire mastermind, J.D. Vance could hardly believe the extent of the revelations. The global corruption network was far more sophisticated than he had ever imagined. But as the last pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Vance realized that this was just the beginning. Political reform was now on the horizon. With so many powerful figures exposed, the public demanded change, not only in the judicial system, but also in the political and financial landscapes. People were calling for a complete overhaul of the system, pushing for stronger checks on political donations, judicial accountability, and global corporate governance. Vance's fight for justice had turned into a movement, one that had inspired millions. He had become a symbol of resistance against systemic corruption, and while the true mastermind had escaped for now, the damage to the system was irreversible. But J.D. Vance wasn't finished. He knew that the work was far from over. With the world watching, he began to mobilize support for a national reform movement that would clean up the political landscape once and for all. And deep down, he knew that his battle was part of a much larger, ongoing fight to bring transparency and justice to the systems of power that had long been hidden in the shadows. The arrests and the subsequent exposure of the international criminal network had ignited a firestorm of public outrage. J.D. Vance, once just a political outsider, was now at the forefront of a massive reform movement. The details of the corrupt global network had spread like wildfire, with news outlets, social media, and grassroots organizations rallying behind Vance's call for justice and transparency. As the months passed, Vance's public image transformed. He became more than just a political figure. He was now seen as a champion for the people, someone who had stood up to the corrupt elites and uncovered a network that had manipulated global politics for decades. Mass protests and town hall meetings sprang up across the nation as people from all walks of life joined the call for a complete overhaul of the system. Vance's team was bombarded with letters of support, donations, and pledges to help fund the legal and political battle ahead. Political donations flowed in, but this time they were transparent, and the money was carefully vetted to ensure it didn't come with strings attached. This was the new era of politics. No more backdoor deals, no more corrupting influence of big money. The exposure of the corrupt network had rocked the foundations of the U.S. judicial system. But with that shockwave came an even more difficult challenge: the fight for accountability. J.D. Vance quickly learned that corruption wasn't just limited to judges and politicians. It was entrenched in the very fabric of the legal system. Lawyers, law enforcement officers, and even federal agencies had been complicit in covering up crimes for years. But now that the light had been shined on the dark underbelly of the system, the pressure to clean it up was immense. Vance worked closely with a team of attorneys and activists to push for legal reforms. His team filed lawsuits against the government, demanding greater transparency in judicial appointments, and advocated for the establishment of an independent oversight committee to monitor corruption at all levels. They also began investigating potential links between powerful business interests and judges in the federal courts. As the legal battles ramped up, Vance found himself in constant meetings with lawmakers, trying to build bipartisan support for a set of comprehensive legal reforms. But the opposition was fierce. The old guard of the political establishment, many of whom had benefited from the corrupt system, weren't ready to give up without a fight. With the stakes higher than ever, J.D. Vance knew the final showdown was imminent. The global criminal network that had once seemed so elusive was now on the brink of exposure. His team had gathered enough evidence to bring charges against the mastermind and the people who had supported him, but the international nature of the conspiracy complicated matters. The billionaire's luxury compound in the Swiss Alps remained a mystery. Despite the coordinated international effort to bring him to justice, he had managed to disappear, leaving only a trail of blood money behind him. However, Vance's persistence paid off. Using cyber intelligence and covert operations, Vance's team was able to trace the billionaire's last known movements. They learned that he had retreated to an undisclosed location, but they also discovered that he had been in communication with high-ranking officials in China and Russia, further implicating him in a global web of corruption. The stage was set for a global sting operation that would not only bring the billionaire to justice, but would also tear down the rest of the global criminal network. The sting operation went forward with the force of a sledgehammer. Interpol, the FBI, and international law enforcement launched a coordinated raid on multiple locations across the globe. In a highly publicized series of arrests, the remaining members of the criminal syndicate were rounded up, including the elusive billionaire mastermind. As the world watched, J.D. Vance's investigation reached its stunning conclusion. The corruption that had spread across continents was finally brought to an end, and the power of the criminal elite was shattered. The billionaire, along with many of his collaborators, was arrested and faced justice in both the U.S. and international courts. With the international sting operation complete, the fallout was immense. Not only did the global political landscape shift, but the entire financial system had been recalibrated. Global corruption was no longer the norm. The reform movement sparked by J.D. Vance's investigation had led to sweeping international reforms, and nations began to pass new anti-corruption laws aimed at preventing the kind of global manipulation that had run rampant for years. In the end, J.D. Vance had done more than expose corruption. He had sparked a global revolution for justice and accountability. The corrupt elites who had once controlled the world were now powerless, and a new era of transparency had emerged. Political systems were reformed, businesses were held accountable, and global institutions were forced to address the issues that had been allowed to fester for decades. J.D. Vance's name became synonymous with justice, integrity, and the fight against corruption. His movement inspired future generations to take action against corruption, not just in their own countries, but on a global scale. The battle had been long, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. And with that, J.D. Vance knew the journey wasn't over. It was just the beginning.